Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. I'm delighted to have the Right Honourable Sir Vince Cable. I've had a lot of respect for him over the years. He was my MP when I was in Twickenham, and we both come from the city of York. He's had a fascinating political career, and also he's a very experienced economist as well as being a politician. I think you need to read his whole bio, and you certainly need to read his latest book. He's written a number of books, but the latest book, The Eclipsing of the West. Vince, welcome. We'll talk about that in a moment, but great to have you on the podcast.
No, thank you. It's a privilege.
Well, Vince, let's talk about the latest book, which comes out in August. You explore the rise of China and India and the transformation of global power. How optimistic are you about the West's ability to adapt and maintain leadership on issues like climate change, globalization, and governance? Or do you feel we're witnessing an irreversible shift?
Well, we are witnessing an irreversible shift. This is mainly driven by economics and demography. I mean, you have the two biggest countries in the world by far in terms of population. They've, in recent years, got their act together economically. 4 decades of phenomenal growth in China. It's now running out of steam, but it's advanced a long way. And we've seen over 3 decades the same thing happening in India. And it's making these countries big in economic terms with a stronger technological base. And part of the argument in the book is that however we got where we are, by mid-century, these two countries will probably be at least alongside the United States, probably past it in many ways. And it's a world we're going to have to get used to. Now, historically, when new superpowers have appeared, we've had war. Japan, Germany, Russia, we know the story. And it's possible that we could be going down that route again, which would be very unfortunate. But it doesn't have to happen that way. And Britain gracefully gave way to the United States in terms of global leadership. And this could happen again, but it does mean accepting that in global fora, dealing with climate change, peacemaking, dealing with global pandemics, these big new superpowers, together with some of the middle powers, Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and others, we're just going to have to accept that these countries are equals and to treat them with respect and try to build something collectively, which is going to be difficult. And particularly with the Trump administration trashing the international system, the dangers of confrontation rather than cooperation are all the more apparent.
Yeah, and it must have been interesting when you were writing the book. I'm writing the next one, Vince, which you're very kindly, hopefully going to come along to the book launch on the 11th of November, which is, the CEO's Compass, Navigating Teams Through Turbulent Times. And it's been about a year worth of writing the book. When you started writing the Eclipsing of the West, I presume you had Biden as president, and then you had Trump. Did you find that you had to adjust what you were writing about because Trump was, disrupting the world order as we know it?
Well, I never take the view that you can predict the future. I was brought up in the Shell scenario planning tradition about thinking of scenarios and options rather than predicting what will happen. And there was always going to be a potential future in which you have rival superpowers. The jargon expression is a multipolar word, which is not potentially an easy one, but one we're going to have to live with. And that's certainly what's emerging from the Trump leadership. But there was another, which I think is now disappearing, which is that you had something called a global West, where not just the technology and economic powers of Europe and the United States together, but common values, that this would form a sort of cohesive force as against more authoritarian alternatives. But the global West is dissolving rather quickly in the Trump administration.
Yeah, the rise of authoritarianism, of what was seen to be generally sort of stable democracy, seems to be really quite a major shift. What's your reading of? Are we going to have more authoritarians? Is America always going to be an authoritarian country? What do you think?
Well, there are a lot of important countries that are, well, you could say semi-authoritarian. In other words, they've jettisoned the real meaning in open, pluralistic, democratic societies, but they haven't gone the whole hog like China to have a embedded one-party state with all the control apparatus around that. Well, Russia is an egregious case, Turkey to some extent, and the United States seems to be potentially going down that road. Is it inevitable? No, but in a world where technological change is very rapid, where large numbers of people feel insecure, when a lot of people, mainly because of technological changes, feel they're disadvantaged, that society is unfair, then they grapple for, simple ideas, simple alternatives, which give hope. And authoritarian leaders are very good at catching on to that. But having said it, there are countries where democracy works, which even in very difficult conditions. I mean, I've been following what's happening in Brazil, which was traditionally regarded as semi-authoritarian state, military rule, this kind of thing, but not establishing the rule of law, functioning democracy. Even Nigeria, despite its rather chaotic politics and economics, is embedding a genuine kind of democratic process. And these things, I think, have to be treated with respect. And India is a marvel in many ways. I mean, people are criticizing the current Modi regime for some authoritarian tendencies, and they're valid criticisms, but it's absolutely remarkable that a country of India's diversity and poverty has managed to keep functioning and increasingly economically successful country together. It is an amazing success story.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. A number of the CEOs or chief technology officers that I coach and work with their teams in America, UK, Europe, they are Indian diaspora. The leaders have come there. And I think it was Modi or someone like him said, if I called home all the Indian diaspora from different parts of the world, most of the tech world would collapse because they've done incredibly well with technology. And your comment about technology reminds me, I think it was E.O. Wilson. I think he's a famed late E.O. Wilson as a biologist, but he said, we have this godlike technology, medieval institutions, and Paleolithic emotions. And it's these Paleolithic emotions that I think are causing so much problems. And when I had, you and I were talking about Anthony Scaramucci, and he was talking about Trump, he was going that there is this great swathe of people in America for a long time felt no one was listening to them. Number of different presidents and their parties weren't listening to them. And then, of course, Trump has played on this. But now his MAGA party is starting to eat him because he's trying to deny that he has anything to do with his best mate, Epstein. And they're going, hang on, you were going to drain the swamp. You're part of the swamp. So it's interesting watching what's going on.
Well, the big dividing line, I think, is this, and it's a difficult one. I mean, in a way, what the Chinese are offering the world is efficient autocracy, which does stuff and delivers in reducing poverty and competent government. Of course, that's a bit of a myth in some respects, but that's their offer.
Yeah.
And the contrast is with dysfunctional democracy. And it's not blindingly obvious if you're a neutral looking at dysfunctional democracy is attractive.
Yeah, I think it's got a dog who's just gone a bit berserk in the background here. I hope you can't quite hear her barking away. But I think that's a very good way of putting it. Efficient autocracy versus dysfunctional democracy. What do you think about China's Belt and Road program? I mean, I've got friends in Jamaica, and I was in Sri Lanka recently, and I was in Botswana, and you see them owning the mines or a port that they've helped, or they built a road across the north of Jamaica where my friend lives, all provided by the Chinese. But there's always a deal with it that you find Chinese port authority people working who also happen to be trained by the Chinese army, they're in these countries all around the world. There's these sort of Chinese bases, a bit like sort of the British Empire, but through the Belt and Road program. What's your view on that?
Well, I think the last phrase is fair. I mean, it is in some ways a modern version of imperial operation. But there are many good examples. I mean, it's not a surprise that many countries in Africa have embraced the Belt and Road Initiative for the simple reason that the West showed very little interest. We walked away. Multinational companies found it wasn't a safe environment. We've cut back on aid programs, so we're not offering anything. Now the Trump administration is throwing up trade barriers, and so the Chinese say, work with us. And some of their projects are a rip-off. There are some very bad cases, and some countries have been left with large levels of debt because it's financed through bank lending, not through aid. But nonetheless, many countries have now got very effective infrastructure being provided courtesy of the Chinese. And it's extended from physical infrastructure to digital infrastructure. And whether you like them or not, Huawei and telecommunications is probably the most advanced telecommunication company in the world with the best technology. And if you're a country which has options, you're going to want to take advantage of it. So Chinese Belt and Road is not driven by generosity,
No.
But equally, it's not just some geopolitical military operation either. I mean, I think its primary motivation is economic. It provides an outlet for their banking operations and their exports, and it's doing good by doing well. I think it's probably the best way of describing it.
It's really good. And actually, in a moment, we're going to talk about some of the leaders you've admired around the world, different politicians you've there. But I was thinking about many of the leaders who are listening to this. A number of them are CEOs of large multinational organizations, and they're looking at their supply chains and they're looking at risk analysis and what does the future hold. And as you talk about in your book, The Eclipsing of the West, they're going to have to aim off for a very different world. But they didn't see until Trump came back in for a second time just how turbulent the world would be, particularly with all this uncertainty about tariffs on, tariffs off, how much this. And so what is your sort of advice to leaders who are trying to read the way the world is going to be going in the next 3 years, let's say? What do you think for those leaders of different businesses? You've been in Shell and other places. You know the business aspects of things, and you've set up the British Business Bank. So what's your thoughts?
Well, I think the simple advice is you've got to hedge, right? You've got to, as far as possible, have a foot in both camps. Often it's not possible because the Americans are bringing in secondary sanctions. We're being forced to choose in some cases, but I think where possible, working with the Chinese, but not being under any illusions. You sup with the devil, you sup with the long spoon. But many companies have done extremely well in China, including the company I used to work for, Shell. And others, they've had bad experiences, but they've proved highly profitable. I'm thinking particularly the pharmaceutical industry. So very often, this is a world you're going to have to live in. And I think the large majority of countries in the world now trade more with China than they do with the United States, considerably more. And they themselves are making it very clear that they want to keep the options of working with China open. There was an interesting survey of leaders, business and political leaders in Southeast Asia, important countries like Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia. And they were asked, who do you now see as the leading country in the world that you have to deal with? And which would you opt for if you were forced to choose? And for the first time ever this year, they opted for China. They were to saw themselves as a bit of the West. They don't any longer. So I think if you're a business leader, that's the world that you're going to have to deal with.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I remember the discussion about reserve currencies began with the Dutch, then the British, now the American is the reserve currency, but there is this prediction that it's going to be China is going to be the reserve currency. What's your view on that?
Well, the dollar is losing its appeal in significant measure because of Trump's behavior, and in particular, the disrespect for the independence of the Federal Reserve, which is the core of America's strength. But nonetheless, it is quite difficult to replace an international currency. For most businesses, most transactions, the dollar is easy to deal with, and disentangling from it is going to be difficult. But nonetheless, I think there will be a steady process by which other currencies, and not necessarily the Chinese currency, but the euro, the Japanese, but then increasingly currencies from the global south are going to be used for transactions and to some extent as reserves in central banks. And I think this is going to be a slow and gradual process rather than spectacular and overnight. But Trump's making sure that that it's going to be more a rapid decline rather than a slow one.
Yeah, I think the uncertainty that he is creating, whether it be NATO or economies or whatever, is making people have to think about other options because they can't rely on America anymore. What's your view on that? That it used to be a world order set up in the aftermath of the Second World War with the World Health Organization, UN, whatever it is. America had set up all those institutions. Now he's unraveling and disrespecting all of those, including slagging off the West, which for a long time, yes, we hadn't honored our contribution to NATO and we hadn't put in the money. We, as you put quite rightly, the UK particularly wanted to have UK levels of tax, but have the benefits of European service levels. But you can't have both. What do you think he's done, and how will it play out over the next couple of years? Do you anticipate?
Well, you could say that one of the areas where Trump has done some good, and it may be unintentional, but has done some good, is making the Europeans more aware of their defense responsibilities. And we are going to have to pay more in tax in order to have better defense. And we're going to have to make sure the NATO alliance works and that we don't give up on Ukraine, where Trump is, put it kindly, unreliable. But so he has forced Europeans to be more responsible when it comes to security threats and defense, which is to be welcomed. But in terms of the wider international system, he's doing a great deal of harm. It's pulling out of important UN institutions. I know the UN can be very cumbersome and inefficient, but trying to destroy United Nations agencies is not clever.
Yeah.
This is part of global governance and the rule system. I mean, what is so ironic is that President Xi is now presenting himself as the champion of globalization, as the global order. Very, very un-Chinese, but he's saying, "Look, I'm happy to be the global leader and set the tone and support international institutions and the rules-based system." He may sound all very cynical, but it's when you see the anarchy on the other side, it's all very, very believable. And the classic instance is issues around climate change and global warming and the international rules in that department. The fact that the Americans are pulling the plug on it is deeply irresponsible, is seriously undermining the credibility of the West.
Yeah. And you and I talked about some of the political leaders that you have known and that you wanted to appreciate as, in this theme of inspiring leaders who've made difficult decisions, which are often unpopular, but are much needed. One of the leaders that you mentioned, of about five that we spoke about, was Deng Xiaoping in China. Do you want to say why you have sort of respect for what he's achieved in the past in China?
Well, he's basically, I wouldn't say almost single-handedly, but is largely responsible for the massive transformation of China from being a rather poverty-stricken and politically chaotic environment which you had in the latter days of Mao Zedong into a super state. which is now dominant in large areas of technology and economically highly successful. And he did that. I mean, he's not an economist. He was a Communist Party activist, a general in the Civil War, um, but learned by doing. A completely ruthless man. I mean, he must have killed large numbers of people, and he personally gave the authorization for the Tiananmen Square events, as they're called in China. But he showed great courage. He suffered, for example, in the Cultural Revolution. His son was thrown down a five-story building and crippled. Uh, like many of his contemporaries, he suffered from Mao Zedong's paranoia, but he survived it. He made compromises, and when he got power, effectively, he was able to do something incredibly important and massive with it. And the reason why hundreds of millions of people in China were lifted out of extreme poverty is largely down to him. That, we should take our hats off where it's due.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's fascinating. And then another couple that you spoke about, which again, people have polarized views on them, but I'd love your view on what you respect about the leadership of President Macron and then Angela Merkel, you also spoke about.
Yes, well, all my French friends loathe Macron. They think he's arrogant, which he is, and thoroughly unpleasant. But actually, I do admire him. Actually, I hope because he was my opposite number when I was Secretary of State for Business. He had the same brief in France, and we talked about industrial strategy. He was amazed to discover that I was operating in the UK. French don't think we do things like that. But I admire him for several reasons. And one was that he was willing to break from the pack and make a bid for the presidency. It was very unlikely, but sheer chutzpah, certain amount of courage and bravado, he won the presidency. And while he's been there, he's done a lot of things that are very unpopular. Started trying to introduce a carbon tax, I think, which produced a lot of protests. More recently, he's been trying to confront the financial problems around an aging population and the need for later retirement ages and so on. And this is all very difficult stuff, but he's done it. I think compared with some of his predecessors in the French presidency, although a lot of people loathe him, they respect him, and I certainly think he's worthy of respect. And he's the sort of nearest equivalent to a sort of British Lib Dem, really, politically.
Yeah.
When probably with Carney in Canada, where there are sort of opposite numbers, and he keeps plugging away on although his domestic authority is being undermined by the last election. He's taking an active lead role in foreign affairs, in trying to pull Europe together, supporting Ukraine, and taking a lead on Palestine, for example, exercising some leadership. So I have lots of respect there.
Yeah, I think that's a fair one about his leadership. And talking about leadership, I had the chance to meet Mark Carney when I was doing an interview, funny enough, with the Lord Mayor. Mark Carney came in his days at the Governor of the Bank of England, and we had a brief conversation. I've always had respect for him. And he's written, like you, he's written a number of books. What's your view on his leadership and how he's showing up so far in Canada?
Well, it's not easy moving from being an economic technocrat to a politician. I know that from experience. He did it very quickly and at the highest level, and showed in the election campaign. He tapped into Canadian patriotism. I suppose a lot of people never thought of the Canadians as being especially patriotic, but when their country was being insulted, effectively, we're going to take you over and run you. He tapped into it in a actually quite constructive way, and he salvaged the reputation of his party and has got himself into government. He now faces a long haul dealing with Trump, who is already saddling Canada with tariffs, being very difficult on a whole set of cross-border issues. But so far, and we're only talking about a few months, Carney's transition from being a technocrat to a politician has been a big success.
Yeah. And then from Mark Carney, on to Angela Merkel. I mean, Germany, I do quite a lot of work with CEOs of different German companies. And they are struggling as the sort of almost a bit of the sick man of Europe at the moment. When you look at the Deutsche Bahn and how badly, underinvestment in their rail infrastructure, it's now coming back to bite them. 10 years of not properly investing and stuff isn't working. And the famous German trains that were always on time, which I remember as a young army officer serving in Germany, isn't happening anymore. And their workers' committees that they have to deal with and agree on how they're going to do things are crippling them, so that many German companies actually find it more appealing to have people in other countries rather than have them as German workers, because their unions are so intransigent about change. What do you make of Angela Merkel, and what do you make of German situation now?
Well, there's a lot of legitimate criticism, some of which you've made, that Germany became over reliant on Russian gas and Chinese markets. And they're now paying for that. So it's a rather painful adjustment process. But I think my admiration for her as a woman chancellor was based on twofold. I mean, she did an enormous amount to knit together a country which has been reunified. I mean, that was German reunification was a massive task, which was, of course, launched by her predecessor, Kohl. But she largely completed it, and the fact that she was an Easterner and had operated for years under the communist system and cemented it was a big achievement. But I think the biggest thing that sort of caught my attention was this decision to admit Syrian refugees. And it's proved highly controversial, and the people on the so-called right have tried to exploit it. But it was from a German with a long history of German nationalism and so on, showing generosity and openness in that situation required a lot of political courage. And it wasn't just a gesture, it was followed through by a very carefully planned program of resettlement, which seems to have been largely successful. I mean, there are a few, it's inevitable in a million people, you'll get a few people who've made trouble and caused difficulty. But it struck me as being an exemplary exercise in political leadership.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair legacy that she has left. And then coming more closer to home, and we'll switch in a moment to talk about your leadership experience across different political parties. You called out Dennis Healey as an inspiring leader in the UK. Tell us about Dennis and why you chose him as a leader.
Well, it's quite difficult, I think, for me to express judgments on people I know and who are still actively around in politics, and historians will come to their own conclusions. I never met Healy personally. I wasn't in the Labour Party when he rose to prominence at the end of his career, but I think it was started as a soldier. Had an exemplary war record. I've never been in a war, so I don't know how to evaluate these things, but it seemed highly impressive. He was then a communist from conviction, not from any subversive reasons. Felt passionately, but then saw the area of his ways when Stalinism produced its horrors. Honest about making a mistake, and switched to what you might call the social democratic wing of the Labour Party, and was an effective operator for decades in that position. And he finished up partly as Minister of Defence, partly as Chancellor, confronting tough economic decisions. And as it happens, I was a civil servant in the Foreign Office when he was constantly grappling with the problems of the 1970s and the IMF and so on. Somebody had to be there and make the tough choices, what politics can involve. And I thought he dealt with great dignity and intellectual honesty. And as we know, more than most politicians, he maintained a sort of happy and fulfilling private life, some people call a hinterland.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
for all those reasons, I thought he's one of the top guys.
Yeah, thank you for that. No, I agree with that one. And which leads me nicely on to my next question, which is about your leadership and leadership across different political parties. I mean, you've been active in Labour, SDP, Liberal Democrats. You work closely with the Conservatives in the coalition government. And I'm interested in your insights that you gathered about leadership styles across these political cultures. And what lessons do you think there are for today's leaders, CEOs, and people listening about bridging ideological divides? What do you
Well, I think
see?
I got into Parliament quite late in my life. I mean, I was mid-50s, actually, and I had 20 years in Parliament. But I was already, by many standards, quite an old man by the time I got into Parliament and was politically active. And I'd been operating in environments in the civil service, in multinational companies, where the kind of party political tribalism is just tiresome distraction from the real world. So I got into politics, skeptical about party political propaganda and mock warfare that we tend to have. And I suppose my instinct was to try to work with people in other parties. A lot of that happens in British politics. I mean, beneath the pantomime, you do in fact get a lot of very sensible collaboration in select committees in the House of Commons, all party groups, just in private relationships. And I think that's how politics needs to be.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think it really is. And the other thing which I think is so fascinating is you often see politicians who know nothing apart from being a special advisor, and then they come in. But you'd already got the legs of civil service and working in multinationals and business. And thinking about the economic side of your experience and background, on this issue of economic policy versus political reality, as an economist, former business secretary, you know the difficulty of aligning economic soundness with political popularity. How do you see the role of economics in shaping politics today, especially with many voters prioritizing identity and values over traditional economic arguments?
Well, perhaps I should say that not too much should be claimed for economics. It's become a kind of a bit like medicine, something that where we can cure issues. It's not actually a precise science. There are genuinely different approaches to economic policy, and it tends to be presented as categorical predictions, which is actually very, very unhelpful. It's a very good training. And one of the key bits of the training is there's this phrase in economics called opportunity cost, which is a rather posh way of saying we have to make choices, and choices involve cost. So it's useful in that sense. I wasn't just involved in business and public service, but I did have a stretch as an academic and taught economics to students and realized the limitations of economics of a discipline. And that you do have to see economics alongside politics. The great economists, Adam Smith, most obviously, never saw economics as some isolated discipline. They saw it as interwoven with politics and with moral values. And that's the way we have to see it. But I think in the current context, the role economists have to perform is to spell out what's now called the trade-offs, making difficult choices because, resources are finite. And going back to the phrase we used earlier, that you can't in the UK have continental levels of public services if you insist on having American levels of tax. Something's got to give. And what's giving at the moment is just putting off the issue and piling up government debt, which causes enormous problems in the future. So trying to insist that 2 + 2 = 4 and not 5 or 7 or 11 is probably the most simple, important contribution that economic training can bring to politics.
And in your teaching that you've done of economics, what is your view about behavioral economics? The human behavior that is linked to that. Do you think it still is quite credible?
Yes, I mean, I think it's one of the ways in which the traditional classroom economics has developed. We've got very stuck on a kind of traditional paradigm, if I could call it. There's some people call it neoclassical economics. Markets are generally efficient and usually work well. Very often they don't. And that trying to understand the incentives that people have, which aren't we don't necessarily just live our lives in response to price signals, but to other incentives and aspects of behavior. So I think this is one of the really encouraging developments in economic thinking, and it's produced practical outcomes. I mean, the British government has got something called a nudge unit, which tries to work out what are the most effective signals that you send to the public if you want to change their behavior, whether it's behaving in a more environmentally friendly way or eating better food or accepting vaccinations. And often the incentives that people have are not just economic incentives. And it's important to understand the process.
Yeah, I do love the idea of. I think it was the book was called Nudge, or it came from was it Malcolm Gladwell? I think he was the one who was suggesting about behaviors and that you could nudge people. But I have a particular bee in my bonnet about health, obesity, the National Health Service being a national sickness service. Not my brother is a surgeon, and many of my family work there, rather than going upstream and addressing issues of health. And many of these big companies like Coca-Cola and the multinationals who you only need to look at the experiments they've done in the Amazonian rainforest as Nestle says it sends its boat up the Amazon, and as wherever it parks, people are now becoming obese who were never obese before. What do you think should be done about the fact that we have got an obesity epidemic in America and now in the UK and many parts where you have ultra processed food? Aren't we going to call out sugar and ultra processed food? We keep ducking the issue, I think, because of lobbying by these very wealthy companies. There's no what is it, marketing budget for broccoli, but there is certainly a huge one for Coca-Cola or for different, ice creams, which are not good for us. What's your own view on this issue?
Well, I have a very sweet tooth, so I'm in a very strong position to call out people who like sweet things. And interestingly, actually, although the Trump administration is doing a lot of damage in this area with this appalling descendant of John F. Kennedy, who heads the health department, one of the sensible things he is doing, amongst all the rather foolish things, decrying vaccines, for example, is declaring war on ultra-processed food. And strangely, the Trump administration seems to be actually doing rather more about this than we do. So that is an important area. The problem about trying to do it in the UK is that there are some people in politics who will immediately jump on you and say this is the nanny state and people should be free to make up their own minds. And of course, sensible adults should be free to make up their own mind. But I think a combination of nanny statism and tax incentives is rather important.
I think so, and particularly when people actually have found now that ultra processed food is highly addictive. It's more addictive than tobacco in smoking. So people say, well, let them choose, but actually once they're addicted to ultra processed foods and it's backed so much, so it's so cheap for people to buy it, and they're in food deserts where there's nothing else to buy but ultra processed food. I can see that going on, which actually leads on nicely to another question I was always been fascinated by, because integrity and compromises are an interesting one we can talk about. But I think political leadership and integrity is a big thing for me. As I look at many of the CEOs and their teams that I work with around the world, you've seen this whole group of CEOs, particularly oligarchs, taking a knee to Trump and going, forget my integrity and what's truthful. We'll just go with whatever he says because we need his backing. Otherwise, he'll close down our business. you've led the Liberal Democrats during challenging times. You've worked across party lines. But what have you seen and how you navigate this idea of integrity and truthfulness while making the compromises that leadership demands? Because you've had to make compromises, and I think you've occasionally been attacked about it, but generally I think you got it pretty right most of the time.
Yes, I mean, I think in the political, I think people often draw analogies between business and politics, but actually politics is much more complex. You know, you're dealing with many more variables. I wouldn't say business is easy or simple. I know it isn't, as I'm dabbling it at the moment, but politics is kind of multidimensional, and you're dealing with different audiences all the time. The public, your own party, your colleagues, your adversaries in Parliament, and getting the balance of these things is probably the really tricky bit. How do you deal with this? Well, my own experience is quite limited. I mean, I think probably the crucial states for me were the point of entry into the coalition government, where all my emotional feelings were that going into a coalition with the Tories was an awful thing to do. And it would also do us a lot of political harm as a party, but recognizing that the country needed parties working together in the back of the financial crisis and the damage it had done, and we needed a stable government, and we needed, parties cooperating, which we did. And a lot of the issues that I was personally responsible for, issues around student tuition fees, most notably, the privatization of industries, including the Royal Mail, my responsibilities for arms export licensing. These are all very difficult, and you did have to make compromises. I think the conclusion I came to after all of this is that you could never be popular, and there's no point aiming to be popular. You hope that when you've retired from it all, history will look more kindly on the things you did and the people around at the time who were frustrated, angry, accuse you of betrayal, all of this stuff.
Yeah, I think it is very interesting that it's in business the same, in leadership of business, that some people mistakenly go for popularity, which of course with Trump and populism, Boris and people like that, and Liz Truss with a dreadful time where she didn't survive longer than a cabbage. People went for the popularity rather than doing the right thing for the country and getting respect. And it's the same in business. A lot of the time, leaders have to do some pretty tough things, which are right for the stakeholders who are involved. But I'm interested in, perhaps we could talk firstly a bit about your own life story, but secondly, I'd like to come back to your time as business secretary and dealing with business issues. I think that was very interesting, that experience you have, particularly to the leaders who are listening. But let's first begin with a bit about your life story, Vince. How you began out, who influenced you, parents, I don't know, teachers, whatever, to shape the leader you have become today. Tell us a bit about your life story, really, the highs and lows.
Well, I think probably the person who had the biggest influence on my life was my father. My mother was lovely and gentle, but not a strong personality. And my father was. Very strong views. I had some very good values. He was incredibly hardworking and austere. Great believer in making a way in the world. And I suppose I learned a lot from him. He was also very prejudiced in ways that were quite uncomfortable. He was strongly opposed to my marriage. I married a Kenya nation woman, Olympia. Had a very happy, loving marriage, but it was strongly opposed by my father for reasons that you can only guess at. But what was remarkable, actually, is that having refused to speak to me for about 5 years after I married Olympia, he reached out and tried to make his peace, and we met up. We had a couple of children then, and he got to know my wife, and they had a lot in common, probably more in common than we had. My wife was a bit of a disciplinarian on education and things of this kind, and they had shared interest in classical music. So I think he finished up, caring for my wife more than anybody else. It was a sort of bizarre turnaround. But I think the simple answer, he was probably the biggest influence, both in a positive way, in the sense that I was always highly motivated and ambitious and hardworking, and also in a negative way that I sort of rejected his prejudices and went in a different direction.
Yeah, it is interesting. Many of the leaders, and we're at about episode 400, Vince, now, that I've had the honor to have on this podcast. Psychologists talk about having a towards driver and away from driver. And sometimes they're encouraged by parents or a father figure, in your case, to work towards hard work, ethics, other kind of, not ethics, because of course you question his prejudice, but hard work and achievement and things like that, and then away from some of their behaviors as well. And it sounds like you had a mixture of the two. I'm really sorry that Olympia, I think she died in 2001. What happened that caused her death?
Well, she had breast cancer. She lived for a long time with the disease, which particularly at the end was extremely painful for her. And she experienced what a lot of other youngish women experience, sort of anger, frustration. Why is this happening to me? But she was a wonderful woman and very courageous, and we had a lot of love. She was a great mother to my children. So I think one of the strange effects of all that was that when she died, I felt I'd grieved enough, and I wanted to start life again. And not long after, I met another lovely woman who I'm still married to, and we've got on with our lives. And I think I owe my late wife that sort of debt of feeling the confidence to keep living. But it was certainly a very difficult situation.
Yeah, and Rachel, your wife now, what debt of gratitude do you owe her during being with you through all your political times and highs and lows? How has she stood? What kind of partnership are you like as a couple?
Well, she's very sensible and easy to communicate with, and very good in dealing with other people. In a sort of, she's politically aware without being a fanatic, and very good sort of personal skills. And certainly, I think one of the things you quickly realize in high office is that, the emotional pounding you get is very difficult. I mean, I guess I'm quite fortunate. I've never had to, succumb to mental difficulties, but you do need help and support and moral backing, which I've had from her and from my children, and that's probably more than any other factors what sort of kept me going.
Yeah, and what has been a common theme among my guests is what I call the three hums: humility, humanity, and humor. Being able to sort of see the funny side of some really difficult times. And I must say, from our conversation, that's the thing that struck me when I've met one or two other politicians through my time working for the late Field Marshal Lord Inge. There was quite a lot of arrogant politicians. So it's quite nice when you meet people who are still grounded. How do you keep grounded and keep your humility and not get too full of yourself, being a man from York?
Well, I don't know how much was just instinct and how much was sort of checking myself not to get too self-important. But I always used to travel around on public transport, even when I was Secretary of State. I didn't have a red box. I had a red placky bag, which I used to carry around on the trains. I still do, use the buses. Just chatting to local people, it keeps you grounded, as you say. And I think it's just, it's very tempting to be, opinionated and believe that you know better than everybody else. So you have to constantly challenge yourself. Is this really something that I want to have out there on the record? So I think you do need this inbuilt cross-checking to go happen. It helps you have somebody with you to do it for you, but you will do it yourself.
I think that's so true. And I was talking to someone who was a senior officer in the Royal Air Force, and somebody else was saying to him, the wife actually of a senior person, that the wake-up call comes for you at the end of your career in the armed forces, or if you're in politics, when the car drives away, no one else is driving it. You're not being driven by someone else, you're driving yourself. But in this case, you kept your feet firmly on the floor by not having to be driven by someone, like two Jags about 100 yards down the road so his wife's hair wouldn't get blown around at their party. But I think I have come across a lot of people who still keep this, do you know who I am? And I'm very important, and I haven't got time to talk to you, little man. And so it's so nice when someone like yourself is prepared to share your insights and views. And thank you, Vince, for being on this podcast. We're coming towards the end, and just before we do the top tip, which is a standalone piece in its own right, I'd love to just have a couple of minutes on business. You were business secretary. You did a number of quite fundamental things in business. But if you were now advising Sir Keir Starmer and his guys on what to do about trying to help the economy grow, rather than just wishfully hoping it would grow, what if there were a couple of things you would do to help the British economy grow? What would you do?
Well, first of all, I'll get round to your question, but before you give me too much of a halo, I should, you mentioned that funny anecdote about John Prescott and the two Jag cars. I have been occasionally reminded by my wife that I do need to think a little bit about her hairdo. There's one occasion I was at a Buckingham Palace dinner, and I took her on the underground, and it was pouring with rain, and I did get a bit of blowback from that. So there are occasions when a ministerial car or whatever, or a taxi even, is a luxury you can indulge.
Yeah.
But in terms of economic growth, I think there aren't magic solutions. I mean, there's no switch. I mean, I've been, around quite a long time. I used to lecture students in the early 70s about why the British economy might not be growing as fast as some of our neighbouring countries, including ones that have tailed off a bit, like Germany and Italy. And there were many factors involved. It wasn't one. But if you put me in the Prime Minister's seat at the moment, I think there are some things that they're doing that are right, but will have a long payoff. I think protecting public investment in infrastructure was a big decision, something we didn't manage to do in the coalition. Gordon Brown didn't manage to do it. And the current Chancellor deserves credit for that. I think in introducing an industrial strategy, which is based largely on the one we had in government, but they've gone back to it. I think that's very important for giving long-term perspective, particularly in some of the key manufacturing industries. I think they're right to improve the planning process. We haven't seen much action yet, but it's certainly the right direction. Building lots of houses is something they've talked about. And may well not happen, but is clearly the right priority. So those are some of the things. But I think you do need to start with realism. That I did some economic analysis recently on the trend growth on British productivity, and until the financial crisis, which changed everything. But until the financial crisis, there was a sort of underlying trend that had nothing to do with who was in government. It didn't matter whether it was George Brown or Gordon Brown or Margaret Thatcher. The trend growth in productivity was pretty much unaffected. So what politicians could do is of limited importance. I mean, the priority for this government at the moment is making sure we don't get into another financial crisis of the kind we had with this trough. We're steering fairly close to the wind. But they are doing some good things around long-term economic growth, and I would want to encourage that.
Okay, that's really hopeful that we can do something with it, because I would love to see the country becoming, having some growth and also being more productive, because there's an awful lot of people who are adding nothing to society and on the take. Let's end with the top tip. So would you kindly introduce yourself? This is a standalone piece. So say who you are. Give us a little thumbnail sketch of what you've done in your life, and then leave us with your top leadership tip. And that'd be a nice way for us to end.
Well, I'm Vince Cable. I'm probably best known to people for having been a politician, 20 years as an MP, 5 years as a cabinet minister, 2 years as a party leader. But I like to think I've done other worthwhile things in life. I had a senior role in Shell, the international oil company. Before that, in international organizations, including the Commonwealth. Worked for the Kenya government for a while in the Treasury, and been an academic, a business person, and a civil servant. Had a very eclectic career, which I benefited from enormously. And I'm now what some people would call an old man. I'm certainly well into my 80s. And I'm trying to find a new career. I've leading a couple of startup companies, one of them hydrogen infrastructure. I write books, and I do quite a lot of voluntary stuff around local charities, inspirational talks in schools and other things. So I've got a very fulfilling life, and I value probably my family relationships more than anything else. So I hope that's reasonable précis.
It is. And your top leadership tip, if you were to, you've got many tips, I'm sure, on leadership, but if you were listening to people listening around the world, if there was one sort of practical tip, Vince, that you'd recommend, what would it be?
Well, it might seem a very odd little point, but I think my tip is to talk to the media, your subordinates, your superiors, in precisely the same way that you would talk in a private conversation. Far too much of the lack of authenticity in politics is caused by people adapting a different pose for different audiences. I think just talking naturally about what you think and defending yourself in a media interview should be just in the same way that you're talking to your friends or your personal critics. So talk and think and act naturally would be my biggest tip, I think.
I think it's a great tip. And Sir Vince Cable, thank you very much for being on and showing up exactly as you said there. And I think people who can take off the mask and be comfortable with who they are, blemishes and all, it's a great honor to have you on. So thank you for your time, and thank you for your service to the country.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you.